Hey everybody, good morning. It's Nick here. Want to say hello to all of you out there in Facebook and YouTube land. We're glad that you are joining us here today on our live stream in person today. We're actually having one of our practice Sundays where we gather around in some small groups and then in a bigger group and just have a discussion together about some of the stuff that we've been talking on Sunday mornings about. And so that makes for some really good conversation in person, but it doesn't translate very well to the screen here. So what we'll be doing today, as we have been for our other practice Sundays, is we'll be playing a replay of a previous message here. This one is from last April, and it is from our Exodus series. And it actually is sort of a sort of series adjacent to what we're doing and what I've been discussing with the Bible here. 2 weeks ago, we talked about how do you read the Bible responsibly, and we talked about asking lots of questions like who, what, when, where, why, and how. And we practiced that actually in our Exodus series. And so I'm going to replay kind of the opening sermon from that Exodus series. And if you're interested in Exodus and you missed that series last year, this might be a good reason to go back and kind of watch some of that material and understand that very fascinating book, a book that's been called the most controversial in the Bible. What? So you might want to check that out too. Then next week we'll be back here. We'll be kind of finishing out our series on the Bible, and it'll be kind of normal next week. So that's pretty much it. There won't be any wrap up at the end. We're just going to play the message here. Hopefully you have a really good weekend wherever you are, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Well, history is sort of a big deal in the Bible. So much of the Bible has like a historical context and background to it. So it's hard not to take all that seriously, when you're reading the Bible. The question is, history is also very, very tricky. No one recalls the past exactly as it is, especially if you weren't there. But even if you were there, you don't recall the past exactly the way it happened because, people can report the same event very differently. And that's an easy thing to grasp when we're dealing with our own lives. But when you're talking about the writing of history, which is what happens in the Bible, you can see there how much the present of the writers and their story and their situation, how much that shapes the telling of the past. Israel is telling that story of, let's say, the deep past, weaving into it its own struggles with God. I mean, Israel means, according to the book of Genesis, Israel means to struggle or strive with God. That is their existence. That is something that has always been a part of the Israelite experience, and yet God still hasn't fully rejected his people. That story is woven into primordial time where Adam plays out Israel's entire scenario in 2 chapters. And I think of the Adam story, which is only, basically chapters 2 and 3 of Genesis. The Adam story is almost a preview of where Israel's entire story is going to go. So I look at the Adam and Eve story or the Cain and Abel story, and I say they're not so much about Adam and Eve or Cain and Abel. They're actually about Israel and Israel's story and where Israel's story is going. Because that's what the Israelites were interested in doing. Storytellers telling their story of who they are as a people by looking at the past. They weren't writing to satisfy intellectual curiosities. Like, I wonder where people came from, right? Or let's talk about 2 brothers fighting. Right? They're telling a story that's meaningful for them where they are. And I think keeping that in mind, again, begins to open up why this Bible is worthy of adult attention and worth paying attention to, because the writers are saying something, and the questions they're asking and the answers they are giving may not be, and in fact typically aren't, the questions we might be asking and the answers we might want to give, right? So I think a first step is to try to just understand, what are they doing? Why are they writing this? What's the purpose of this? And then we can take the responsibility of saying, okay, well, what about us? How do we connect with this? And sometimes that's more obvious than other times. But that's where we come into this story, by learning to sort of ask these ancient questions and then doing the hard work of understanding, thinking through in community okay, what do we do now with these stories too? And that is not a neat, nice, tidy approach, but that's okay, right? I mean, we're dealing with God, we're dealing with life, we're dealing with antiquity, and it's not going to be easy. This is not a quick fix. Here's the answer, turn to this page, and now you're done. Actually, engaging the Bible doesn't end anything. It actually begins a whole lot. And I think that's a good thing, and I think that's the way it's even supposed to be.
Hey, thanks, Peter Enns. That was great words, and I really appreciate that. We're going to hear a little bit more from him as we go throughout this new series, and he's got a lot of good things to say, but what he doesn't have is as cool of a shirt as I do. And my children would dispute this and say this is a very uncool shirt, and I would tell them that all the kids, all the cool kids on TikTok are wearing a really cool shirt that looks like this. And I've got this shirt on today because it's just my exuberance and excitement over the nice weather that we're having. It's just so beautiful outside, and we've been like barbecuing every night. We've been outside hanging out, having fun, playing in the backyard, just getting out. It feels like we've been stuck inside in the rain and the cold for months and months, and it feels that way because it has been that way. But now we get to get outside, and so even last night we had some friends over in the backyard, you know, and barbecue and just kind of hanging out and sitting around the table outside, and it's not too cold, and we're just kind of enjoying ourselves, and we're out there talking, and pretty soon we started talking about all the inside things we've been doing this year, right? And the big thing we started talking about was TV shows and TV series that we're watching. You know, kind of what are you streaming on TV? What are you watching these days? I mean, because we are sort of in the golden era of television. There's just so much good television on, and you can stream it on, you know, Netflix, Hulu, Disney Plus, you know, HBO Max, Paramount Plus. I mean, just there's so many streamers and ways to watch these incredible shows. And our friends, you know, we were talking last night, and they just said, you know, even if you didn't have a job and you could just sit at home and watch TV all day, you'd never get through all the TV shows that there are to watch. There's so many good series. And so Tanya and I, we're watching, we've gone through lots of series lately, but we're watching Bosch right now on Amazon Prime. Anybody seen Bosch? It's kind of a crime procedural, you know, it's a detective show, and you got this detective Bosch, and I think there's 6 seasons, you know, and as is usual, we usually come on things a little later than everyone else. So we started back at season 1 that took place 6 years ago, you know, and we've just been watching all the way through, and this show is just gripping, you know, it's interesting. You want to keep watching, and that's how all of these good series are, right? You know, you start watching them, and you get through a season, and a storyline in that season sort of wraps up, but there's some unresolved stuff that kind of leaves you in some sort of cliffhanger feel, and so there's more to come, and so you've got to watch the next season, and usually we'll get to the end. In fact, last night we just watched the final episode of season 4, and you know what I wanted to do last night? Instead of go to bed like I knew that I should, I wanted to start season 5, you know, because I was like, oh my gosh, what happens next? I mean, there's just so much as season after season happens, this carry through and this cliffhanger stuff. Now, reading through the books of the Bible is a little bit like reading through or watching different seasons of a TV show. Now, a few months ago, we did a series on the book of Genesis. You remember this? The Genesis genealogies, reading the story of origin through ancient eyes. And we finished it a few months ago, and then we jumped to Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount most recently. And so we finished Genesis, and hopefully it was really helpful. I got feedback on a lot of you just saying like, wow, there's a whole bunch of stuff that we unpacked in Genesis that I didn't know before. And so it was a really fun series, at least for me, to go through. But we completed it. We got to the end. But the interesting thing about Genesis is it's really only season 1 of a 5-part series. And this series is called the Pentateuch. All right? And so the Pentateuch is, we discovered this in the series on Genesis. The Pentateuch is just the first 5 books of the Old Testament, or what I sometimes call the First Testament, all right? Because it is older, but it's the First Testament. It's not like irrelevant anymore, right? So the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, those are the parts that we call the Pentateuch, right? And so we went through this book of Genesis, but it's kind of like going through a series of a TV show, you know? None of these books or seasons are complete on their own. Like a good TV series, you get to the end of one and it kind of leaves you on a cliffhanger until you pick up the next season. And none of these seasons tell the whole story on their own. You need to put them all together in order to get the whole story. And so to understand season 2 of the Pentateuch, you really need to have watched or read season 1 of the Pentateuch, because season 2 relies heavily on images and ideas that carry over from season 1 or book 1, Genesis. And so, before we get into season 2 here, I feel like we need to do a quick flashback, like what usually happens when you start a new season of your favorite television show. They usually say, previously on Bosch, right? And so that's what we need to do here. Previously on the Pentateuch. In fact, we need some imaging for this. I gotta talk to Ralph. We need to get like each week like a little imaging here. Previously on the Pentateuch. So we need to go back and just kind of look real quickly here at what we learned in Genesis. Now, when we went through this Genesis series, we quickly discussed from the very beginning, because you get like thrown right into the deep end in Genesis 1 with like, you know, like the creation narrative stuff there. And we discussed very early on how Genesis is not a science book, that Genesis is not what we would think of as a science book. Modern people like to go to Genesis 1 to find out how God made the world and use it like a science book. But it's really not so much a journalist report on how God made the world. In fact, we discovered as we went through Genesis that it actually sort of starts assuming that the world is already made, that you could definitely read it that way, that the earth is already in place as you begin the book of Genesis. And that ancient people, the Hebrews, were not really concerned about whether or not God made the world. They just assumed that he did that. But that what Genesis was really about wasn't whether or not or how God made the world. What Genesis was about through the eyes of these ancient Israelites was about how God ordered the world. How he brought order out of chaos. You see, because in the ancient world, without science, lots of life in the ancient world seemed sort of chaotic or random. And so the power of a God wasn't demonstrated so much in how this God or gods created the world. Everyone just assumed that they did that they had the power to do that. But the real power, the real way to demonstrate the power of your God was to show how your God tamed or ordered the forces of the world. Because the ancient world seems so random, right? I mean, sometimes the crops would grow and sometimes they wouldn't grow. And sometimes it would rain and it wouldn't rain. And we kind of have this idea that probably the crops need that rain. And we've noticed that when it doesn't rain, the crops don't seem to grow. But how come sometimes it rains really good for a year and then there's other times we hit into this drought, right? So things seem sort of chaotic and random at times. And without science as an explanation, the ancients had to find a way to describe the things that were really happening. And so they would tell these stories of how their gods ordered or gave purpose to the world around them. They were writing history as a way to explain why things worked in the world that they lived in. Now, that seems to be clearly the sense of ordering the world that we see in Genesis 1 and throughout Genesis. But the most important order out of chaos for the Hebrew people was how they were ordered into the people of God, or as a nation. That they weren't just some random people, but that they had been chosen by God, given a purpose, ordered. And so Genesis actually introduces us to the story of Israel. Genesis is not trying to tell us how the world came into being, but how the people of Israel did. It's their story of ancestry. It's their family history, and it's giving purpose to their being. It's giving order to their existence. It's giving them a sense of identity and rooting them in their family history. And this is really true of the whole Pentateuch as well. Now, another thing that we learned as we went through the Genesis series previously on the Pentateuch is that it was written or sort of assembled likely not during the events that it describes. Okay, so it wasn't Adam and Eve with a pencil and pen jotting down their notes on how things were happening and just kind of keeping a diary on how the world was created, right? But that it was actually written and probably assembled much, much later as the Israelites are coming out of captivity in Babylon, okay? Because much, much later, Persia and finally Babylon conquers Israel, defeats them, destroys their cities, kills many of them, and hauls the rest of them off into captivity. And so these people are conquered, and their God is sort of dead. That's what it meant in the ancient world if your people were defeated, that another nation's God was stronger than your God, right? And so these people are hauled off into a new land, their culture is disintegrated, and they need a sense of identity. And so really the Pentateuch is probably put together and assembled during this time of the Babylonian captivity or coming out of it, because Israel needs a story of identity as they seek to reestablish who they are as people and to rebuild their land and their religion. And so Genesis traces their lineage, the people of Israel, back to these important encounters with God that inform them about who they are. So we meet these characters, like we go all the way back to Adam, and we meet Abraham, and Isaac and Jacob, and it ends with this important character, Joseph, who is a son of Jacob, and he is sold by his brothers into slavery. He ends up in Egypt. That's where he's taken as a slave. And through a series of events, he kind of goes from rags to riches. He ends up going from a slave to someone who is in a position of power in Egypt. And through another pretty remarkable series of events, he ends up becoming reconciled to his brothers who sold him into slavery and his family. And there is a major drought and famine going on, and so he actually relocates his whole family to Egypt, where he can protect them and make sure that they have plenty of food and an existence, right? And so now, as we end the Pentateuch's first season, Genesis, we have all the tribes of Israel here. I mean, we've got all Joseph's clan living in the Egyptian empire far from home. And so there's sort of a cliffhanger here of what will happen next. And so that brings us to season 2 of the Pentateuch, right? And it's a whole new series here that we're going to be starting in season 2. And we're going to call season 2 the Exodus Records, reading history through the eyes of ancient theology. But it starts a whole new scene, right? And it takes place a few generations later. You know how TV shows, you get to the end of one little thing, and then you're gone to the next season, and they go 6 months later. Okay, this is like several generations later. It picks up in Exodus 1, verse 6 is where we'll start, and we discover very quickly that the scene has changed dramatically in Egypt for the descendants of Joseph. Let's read this here. Exodus 1, verse 6. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and that whole generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now a new king arose over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses, for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites, and they made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks they imposed upon them. Now, some period of time here has passed, and we have a new problem, a new scene. Generations have passed. Joseph and all his brothers, they've died, but a new Pharaoh has come to power, right? And he does not remember Joseph, and he doesn't know any of these Hebrew people personally like the old Pharaoh did. And he sees all these Hebrew people who are not just one family now, they have multiplied. It appears, according to the Exodus text here, that there are a lot of Hebrew people now living in the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh and his elite here feel very threatened by these Hebrew people. And so season 2 starts with a little bit of intrigue, right? Joseph's people now, his descendants, are now slaves, mistreated by the empire. And this is something that Babylonian exiles years later can definitely understand as they assemble and compile this story together. It is a story that resonates with their current experience of life. And so before we go too far here, I want to mention just a couple of things I want you to notice, okay? And the first thing is this. It's that the name of Pharaoh here isn't mentioned. And it's pretty interesting, and we're going to talk about this more later. But just I want to mention it here just before we get too far, because many kings are named in the Bible specifically, but not this one. It just says Pharaoh. And this is such an important story, right? I mean, I would say it is the most important story in the entire Old Testament, and really in the sense of identity for the people of Israel going forward. Even it has a huge impact even on the New Testament and how Jesus sees himself. And so it seems like this is such a critical story that you'd know the name here, but it appears that the name of this Pharaoh has probably been lost, which makes sense if it's written not by some people in the present day experience of this story, but it makes sense if it's written by people centuries later that no longer remember the name of the specific Pharaoh, but they have a passed on memory of this event. There's another thing I want to just mention here as we get started, and that has to do with the name of the book. We call it Exodus. Now, we didn't read that right here, but I want to point out kind of where the name comes from. We have many movies that come from the book of Exodus, right, that we're all familiar with, like the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, Prince of Egypt, Disney made theirs, VeggieTales, I think, has even done, kind of the Exodus story. But so we know the Exodus story, and we know it by the name Exodus. But it might be interesting to note that Exodus is not its original name. That is not how the ancient Hebrews knew this text or this material. The name Exodus, it actually comes, it's a name that's given by the Greek-speaking Jews much later. And Exodus, it comes from a Greek word, not a Hebrew word. It comes from a Greek word, exodos. And ex just means from out of or out of. And hodos means way, road, journey, path. So the word just literally means way out, or the road out. And this is the name that's given to it, obviously, because Moses leads the people out of Egypt. But in Hebrew, the name of the title of the book is Shemot, and it means names. And so that is how the Hebrew people know this work, not as Exodus. The ancient Hebrews know this as the book of names. And it gets this title from what we call an incipit. An incipit is just a ancient way of naming books. They didn't often title their books. Most authors are like, I gotta come up with a catchy title so that people will be intrigued by the title of this book and want to buy it. And ancients just didn't think that way. So they just named their material usually after the first word of the work, or maybe the first kind of phrase of the work. And so we see this here in Exodus. Its original name just comes from Exodus 1, where it says, "These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt," right? And so it just kind of lists here Jacob and all of his sons, right, that relocate because Joseph has invited them into Egypt. And so this book, it starts with a family lineage list. It starts with the family history, the names, and that's what this book was called, the names. Now, it's interesting to note that actually the book of Exodus doesn't even begin with the word names. It begins with the word and. That is the first word in Hebrew of Exodus 1:1. Now, as we look at it in English here, right, the first word in the NRSV translation is what is on the screen here today. And is not the first word in there, right? And translators have kind of left out the word and because, and is a weird word to start a sentence with, and it doesn't seem to add a lot to the title here. Although what you could do is you could look up some other translations, and you'll see that some English translations do actually preserve the fact that the Hebrew word here that begins is the word and English translations usually translate it as so. so, or and. And that's interesting to note because what that means is that whenever you start a book and it begins with the word and or so, you're probably not coming in at the beginning, right? You're probably coming in somewhere in the middle of the story. And that is what is happening here in Exodus. It's important for us to know. This is season 2 of the Pentateuch, okay? Not season 1. And if you haven't gone back and understood season 1, there's going to be some imagery and some ideas and some storylines that have been started in Genesis that are going to continue to play out through the season 2 of the Pentateuch, which we call Exodus, right? So it's important that we have a little background on Genesis before we jump right into it. Okay, now a couple of things we want to kind of catch up on here and just get right out from the beginning before we jump into this book. And I know everybody wants to just jump in the book and hey, let's learn about Exodus and all this stuff, and that is really good, but we always want to start with some background material because understanding a little bit about the context of who wrote it, when, and why, and all that really goes a long way towards understanding what the Bible text is trying to say to the original hearers, and then what we can extrapolate it means to us as well. And where we get into a lot of trouble is when we dive into Bible texts and we just start unpacking them and trying to make sense however it just kind of reads to us without taking any of the context into account. And so we want to make sure that we do that today. So let's just start with the simple questions. You probably went to, I don't know, some sort of English class in school and you had to do some journalistic writing and you had to ask your basic questions, right? Like who, what, when, where, why, and how. And just that's what you're trying to do is get the basic questions out. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. So let's start with the who. Who wrote the book of Exodus? That's a question I want to know because no one actually knows. Who wrote the book? Anybody have an answer to that? Who wrote the book of Exodus? Well, we don't really know, is the truth. Tradition ascribes it to Moses himself because he is the main character of the show. Now, obviously, Moses doesn't show up until the book of Exodus, season 2. But in seasons 2 through 5, Moses is the big deal, right? I mean, he is sort of the main character of this show we call the Pentateuch. And so tradition has just described Moses as the author, not because the work is titled or is accredited to Moses in any way. The text itself doesn't give us any sort of indication of who is responsible for it, but because he's the main character of the Pentateuch, it's often, tradition has described him as the author. It's sort of like Bosch, right? The show is called Bosch, and it's a really creative title because the guy's name is Harry Bosch. They just named the show after the main character, right? But they don't mean that he wrote the show. And so that's the same thing that we're running into here with Exodus. It's often ascribed to Moses traditionally as the author, but most scholars do not think that it's possible for Moses to have written at least the majority of the text. It's unlikely that he wrote it. The text doesn't claim that Moses wrote it, but none of the Pentateuch records any authorship, and most of the Bible doesn't record any authorship of any of the books. And so we have to try to make some guesses surrounding this. So who could possibly have written this book? Well, it probably wasn't Moses, and we looked at some of the reasons for that actually back in the beginning of the Genesis series. So if you want to go back there and find the first sermon in the Genesis series, you can find a little bit about why most scholars don't think Moses had a lot to do with the writing of the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch, for a lot of reasons, a couple of them are Moses often, if he is writing it, he's often speaking of himself in the third person, which is awkward today and would have been awkward then as well. But also there's a moment where he describes, the death of Moses is described, which that's tricky to describe your own death. And there's a bunch of other reasons, right, that we sort of unpacked at the beginning of the Genesis series. So if you want to go back and look at that, you can do that. So if Moses didn't write it, then who wrote this thing? Well, the truth is, we don't really know exactly. But our guesses on that actually lead us to the next question, which is when? When was the book of Exodus written? Well, this was to be another good thing to know, isn't it? I mean, when something is written tells us a lot about why it was written. For instance, if you were to write a story today, right, a short story about your life this last year, and you write it and everyone's wearing masks and they're socially distanced and you can't go into restaurants and you had to do church online and all this kind of stuff. I mean, knowing the context of what happened in 2020 and now 2021 would go a long way to helping you understand the stuff that is being written about in this short story that you are writing. And so the same is true of the Bible. Understanding what is going on in the world or in the lives of these people as they are writing this material goes a long way to understanding what it means to them. And so, of course, if we know the when, we then have a narrower idea of who. Now, most scholars believe that the whole Pentateuch, as we've said before, was written during or at the end of the Babylonian exile, just as we talked about with Genesis. And so this is a TV series, here, or a collection of books about who is Israel, right? This whole material is really trying to lead us to some sense of identity for the people of God, for Israel. And so it's probably made up of a lot of oral stories and traditions that had passed around and are finally compiled and edited during the Babylonian exile. And it makes a lot of sense for that time period to be when this material comes together, because when you're hauled out of your own land and your culture is destroyed, you sort of need something to ground you, right? You need a story that reminds you who you are. And so enter the Pentateuch. So the who is tied to the when. And the who is then people living during the Babylonian exile. And once we talk about the who and the when, then it kind of covers a little bit of the why as well, doesn't it? The why did they write it? The people of Israel need a story of identity at this time to remind them who they are and who God is. Something to connect to as they attempt to survive exile and as they go to reestablish themselves as a nation after exile. But none of those are really the big controversy of Exodus, okay? I mean, we got the who, we've got the when, and the why questions. And there is plenty of debate over all three of those questions. Who wrote it? Some people are still starkly Moses wrote it, even though I don't think there's good evidence for that. People do argue about when it was written, and they argue about the why circumstances as well. There's plenty of debate around those questions, but that is not where the real controversy lies in the book of Exodus. And make no mistake about it, Exodus is, and you probably wouldn't have just kind of guessed this straight off, but Exodus is one of the most controversial books in the Bible, okay? And the reason has nothing to do with the who and the when and the why, but it has everything to do with the what, all right? And it is, what I mean by this is the historicity of what we're reading. In other words, what really happened here? Did any of what we're reading actually happen? Was there ever a large population of Jewish people enslaved in Egypt? Did a deliverer show up who brought some miraculous plagues and caused ecological and economic damage to Egypt in such a way that it forced Pharaoh's hand? And did this group of slaves overthrow their oppressors and plunder them as they left? And did, as they walked out of this land, did they end up meeting up at a sea that parted for them and they walked through on dry land and the sea enclosed over Pharaoh's army behind them? And then this even starts to go beyond season 2 into seasons 3, 4, and 5. But did these people, these slaves now freed, did they wander around a desert for 40 years and eventually enter into what would be called the land of Israel through military conquest, displacing the people who were already living in that land through a series of battles and settling it for themselves? Did the conquest of Canaan really happen? So the big question of this material, of this text really is, did any of this actually happen? And this is the big controversy of Exodus. And it's pretty important because, this is the dominant story of the First Testament, of the Old Testament. It's the dominant story of Israel's life. And the truth is, there is no direct evidence for really any of it. There's no direct evidence of a large Hebrew population in Egypt at any time. There's no Egyptian documents. There's no archaeological evidence that would say that that ever occurred. In fact, even as we look forward to the conquest, as the people of God go into the land of Israel, there is just really no archaeological evidence that any of these battles that were said to happen ever occurred. Now, that doesn't mean that nothing happened. It just means that we don't have any evidence for it. And we should probably be honest about that. Now, there's evidence for lots of things in the Bible, right? There's all sorts of things you read about in the Old Testament and the New Testament that archaeological finds can back up and document, that there's all sorts of ancient manuscripts, even from different cultures and nations, who back up biblical accounts, all right? There's all sorts of evidence for things in the Bible, but not for this particular story. There's no evidence of there ever being a large population of Jews in Egypt. There's no documented evidence of miraculous plagues and destruction. There's no evidence of a slave revolt or the conquest of Canaan. And so the big controversy of Exodus is, did any of this really happen? Or is this all fake? Now, some people say, yes, it's all fake. This whole stuff is just too fantastical, plagues and miracles and seas parting. I mean, that can't be true. That stuff doesn't really happen. It's too fantastical, too mythical. This cannot be true. But yet, I don't know. I mean, the fact that something is miraculous isn't a problem for me, right? In fact, I actually, when I read the biblical material, because I have this predisposition in believing that there is a supernatural God, when I go to the biblical text, I sort of expect some unusual things to be happening. In fact, that's sort of confirmation for me that there is a supernatural God, because I'm seeing supernatural things breaking out around me. And so the idea of the supernatural itself, for me, doesn't disqualify the events of Exodus. In fact, it sort of lends me to think that something did happen there. I'm more likely to believe that because I think a supernatural God would be involved in supernatural things. Other people say, no, this isn't fake. And they use the argument of silence, and they say, well, Egypt doesn't record, anything about this. I mean, we have the biblical text that tells us the story, but we don't have any records from Egypt because Egypt is sort of embarrassed by this whole deal, right? It's embarrassing that your slaves overthrew you, took all your stuff, and then drowned you in an ocean, that their little god was better than all of your gods, right? And so, of course, they didn't record this. It's hugely embarrassing. Why would they write it down? They don't want people to know all about this. And that sounds compelling, except for that's just not how the ancients dealt with embarrassment. Nations often experienced embarrassment, but the way that they dealt with it is they didn't hide it by not recording it. Instead, they spun it, right? So they'd say, well, it's not that they were more powerful than us. It's not that these Hebrew slaves were just stronger and that their God was stronger than ours. It's just that somehow we made our gods unhappy, we sinned or something, and so our gods were unhappy with us, and they punished us by allowing these Hebrew slaves to win, right? It's just kind of to spin the embarrassment here. It's still embarrassing, but it's not because you're so great, it's just because we did something stupid. In fact, we actually see that thinking even from the Hebrews in the Bible, right? That they end up in captivity. Why? Well, not because your God, your Babylonian God, was stronger than ours, but because we broke the commandments of God, and our God was allowing us to be punished, right? This idea for the Egyptians here, it would be more likely for them to spin it than to hide it. And it's not just that there's no record of it in Egypt, but there isn't any record of this story in any of the other surrounding people. And that just seems highly unlikely. I mean, you just couldn't hide stuff like this. Surrounding nations would have heard of the collapse in Egypt, right? I mean, you've got an economic and ecological, rivers turning to blood and crops being destroyed. You've got a huge impact there economically and ecologically they would have heard of, and a huge escape of a slave population. And even without Twitter, okay, they didn't have Twitter in Moses' day here, but even without Twitter, news of this would have spread throughout the ancient world. I mean, did you hear what happened in Egypt? You'd have some stuff like that, but there aren't any records of it. Which, again, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means that we don't have any evidence for it. Now, all that said, I think there is some at least suggested evidence that something happened in the story of Exodus. Whether or not it is exactly as Exodus tells the story, that we can argue about. But I think I'm in the camp of believing that something did happen in the Exodus memory here. A good example of this is actually the Song of Moses. And the Song of Moses is Exodus 15, and it is considered by linguists to be one of the oldest pieces of the Old Testament, actually, Exodus 15. And it's probably penned somewhere, they think, maybe around 1200 BCE, so quite a while ago, and not long after when the events of the Exodus narrative that we'll be reading would have occurred. And you say, well, how do they know that that one piece is so old? I mean, why would that one piece be so old, but the rest is written centuries later? Well, the reason is because language changes. It evolves, doesn't it? I mean, language just does not stay the same. The way that you talk, 400 years ago is pretty different than the way that we talk today. It's like you ever read your Bible in the King James Version and you're thinking, wow, I mean, what are they talking about? All these ye's and thous and these, it's like Shakespearean language, right? You look at some of the Shakespearean language like anon. When was the last time you used the word hark? Hark, everyone, to what I have to say today. We just don't talk like that, right? It's Shakespearean language, and so we see words like this and we know, oh yeah, that's obviously not from the 21st century here, but we do know where to place it. We say, oh yeah, this is more in Shakespeare's era. And so linguists, they study the evolution of language. And so Hebrew linguists have studied the Hebrew language, just as English linguists have studied the evolution of English and how it changes. And so they read this bit of Hebrew and they say, yeah, there's some Hebrew words in there that's like old Hebrew. It's an older form. In Exodus 15, it talks about Pharaoh being tossed into the sea and praising Yahweh for killing the Egyptians in the sea. And, it's probably been changed and adapted and added to later in Israel tradition to get to what we read today. So probably the Exodus 15 that we're reading today isn't all old. It's not probably all from the 12th century, but there are parts of it that linguists say fit with that time period. So it actually is preserving the memory of something that happened. Another example of this is in Judges 5. There's a story of Deborah, and scholars often point to this text containing older Hebrew language. Genesis 49 is Jacob's last words to his son before he dies, and that linguists say looks to be an older piece as well. But all these things suggest that there's some sort of early memory here of something happening. And we could argue about how much of it happened, but it does appear that something happened. Something with Egypt and a Pharaoh and the people of Israel. And there was something here that happened with God triumphing over Egypt's empire. It just appears something seemed to happen. Another echo of history here, another reason that just kind of a clue that something happened, has to do with some of the names in this story. For instance, Moses itself. Moses is an Egyptian sounding name. We're aware of other names that are Egyptian that use this ending, Moses. So like King Tut, maybe you're familiar with King Tut, right? So the full name, Tutmosis. And it really just means like born of. So born of the god Tut, right? And that's King Tut, King Tutmosis. He's the one born of the god Tut. And so Moses appears to be a part of a longer Egyptian name. And so this isn't really a Hebrew name, it's more of an Egyptian name, it appears. And so there's something, at least to the story here, that seems to draw upon an Egyptian memory of some kind. Now, does that prove that Exodus happened the way that the book says it happened? No, but it does show that there's something about an Egyptian memory. Something about Egypt is strong and real in Israel's memory. And so the story of Exodus does not seem to just be made up whole cloth. It seems as though there's some historical reality behind the story of Exodus and the rest of the Pentateuch in general. And so I want to introduce you to kind of a term here that is a term that the guy in the video just before we started here, Peter Enns, is sort of a term that he has coined that I think is a useful way for us to begin to deal with this and interact with the book of Exodus. And he calls this term mythicized history. Now, there's some people that say Exodus can't be believed, none of it is true, there's no basis in reality, it's just all myth. And then there's some of the people who would say, no, it's not myth. It's happened 100%. Every single detail is completely accurate. It is history, right? And so you have these two kind of polar options here. And Peter Enns is introducing us to a new phrase here. It's not really a new idea, but a new phrase to help us understand that these polar opposites are not our only options, right? That there is actually maybe a more nuanced understanding that scholars grab onto most that might be useful for us in helping to understand this material. And that is this idea of mythicized history, which means this is a story being told that is rooted somehow in some historical reality. It has some real historical roots, but it has been adapted for theological purposes. And so parts of the story may have been mythicized or maybe what we call spiritualized, but it is history too. It's been told through the lens, though, of the genre of ancient myth. Now, I know the word myth sounds scary to us, because like, well, then you're saying that the Bible's just not true, right? And so a lot of times people who've grown up in religion are really uncomfortable around the word myth. But let's remember here that we saw this in Genesis 2, the use of ancient creation myth as a genre. Myth as an ancient genre doesn't mean even necessarily that it is a story that is fake or made up. It's simply how ancient people tied theology to their everyday events. They weren't trying to lie to anyone or make up a story, but they were rather trying to teach how God is connected to everyday events. And so Peter Enns has a great quote on myth. He says, "A myth is a story about the gods at the dawn of time that helps explain why things are the way they are here and now." Sound familiar to Genesis? Myth is a genre of theology that helped ancient people understand how God ordered the chaos. It's a common ancient way of teaching theology, using story based in truth often to communicate theological realities. And this, I would contend, is how we ought to read ancient texts, particularly this section of the Pentateuch and much of the Pentateuch. And perhaps it feels awkward to us, right? But the ancient Hebrews don't much care about our preoccupation with objective science and objective history, okay? They just don't. You remember we read Genesis 1 and 2 and we found all sorts of contradictions there, two things that can't be true at the same time. And we thought, what the heck? This is not how we'd write a science book, right? Yeah, exactly. The Hebrews weren't interested in objective science. They didn't even know about objective science. They were telling a theological story. And as we get to Exodus, not much has changed, right? These ancient Hebrews, they don't care about how much we want an objective history, a historian writing down everything that happened in an accurate way. They want to tell us a story that is giving them a sense of purpose and identity and telling them who they are and teaching them about who God is. And so what we need to do as we read the story is kind of put away our modern bias for a moment and enter into Exodus as an ancient Israelite and allow Exodus to speak the way it wants to speak and to read it with ancient eyes. So how we're going to read Exodus in this series is this way. Not as historians, not as a historian account of objective history. And we aren't going to be looking for, detailed and accurate accounts of every act that happens, right? We're reading for the theological truth about God and his people that it intends to convey. And we're going to have to come to grips with some of this story being mythicized as we go through it. It's just not history the way that we would think of it, right? This just isn't one of those history books that you pop open and you read through and giving a detailed account of everything that happened, supposedly objectively. Certainly, all the events that happened could have happened, right? God could do anything. But did it happen? Or how much of it happened? All of that as we go through this series, we will be asking and questioning. And I will make the case that even if the evidence indicates that perhaps some of these things didn't happen exactly as the story tells it, we don't really need to be unnerved or outraged. That the story still functions and should, whether or not every detail is historically accurate or not. And so here's what I want you to do for a minute. Just breathe, okay? We got to let go of our modern need for historical accuracy and just breathe. Exodus is theology, not an encyclopedia. Now, just because one part of the Bible may have some mythic elements to it does not mean that we have to apply that to every part of the Bible. Not all parts of the Bible are the same genre. I feel like we have to say that a lot, okay? The Bible is not a book so much as it is a library collection of material involving lots of different genres. And just by saying that this particular part of the Bible is this genre does not make every part of the Bible that genre. For instance, the Gospels. I think it's very important to believe that the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus is historically true. That it happened, that he died, that he came back to life. I mean, for those of us who are following Jesus and believe that we get new life through him, everything hangs on that being a historical reality, okay? I believe that is historically true. But we don't read poetry, legal code, wisdom literature, etc. the same way. Not every part of the Bible is the same type of material that the Gospels are. The Bible is a library of material with different genres, including mythicized history. That's just one of them. And to say that this one part of the library is mythicized history is not to say that the whole thing is. So this doesn't mean that I don't think there's anything, that there's nothing historical about this text. I do think something happened here. I don't think this story is just made up whole cloth. But I don't think we need to spend a lot of energy and time defending the accuracy of all sorts of elements, because then we end up just missing the point that the story wants to tell. Get it? Okay. One small difference here I want to point out, though, and that is the difference between two ideas: mythicized history and historicized myth. Wow, that is like a tongue twister. Wow. Mythicized history and historicized myth, okay? What we're going to be talking about is mythicized history. That means it has a root in history. There's some root of historical fact here, and maybe as they told the story, they then adapted it for theological purposes, but there is a historical root there. There is another idea here, and that is the idea of historicized myth, and that is the idea that the story starts as a myth. There is no historical roots whatsoever, but now we've just added some references to historical points to make it feel like something that really happened. It's like watching your Avengers movie, right? And you watch the Avengers and the whole thing is myth, it's not real. Oh wait, my son is watching this and he's just now learning that the Avengers aren't real. But anyway, it's not real, right? But they place it in our time and so that we can see things and it feels real to us. That is all myth. It's just been historicized. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a story based in some historical reality that moves beyond it, though, to tell a bigger story about God. Because at the heart, this book of Exodus is really about this God Yahweh. That is the heart and purpose of this story, reminding these exiled Jews in Babylon that they have a God who sees them and their plight, and that he actually cares. And so we see this as kind of a good just text to remind us what Exodus is all about. In Exodus 2, starting at the end of verse 23, it says, "The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out." These are the Israelites in Egypt. But it's easy to see the Babylonian exiles reading that line and thinking about their own groaning under the experience of exile. And out of the slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then this last verse, I think, is just a pretty good summary of the book of Exodus. "And God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them." You catch that? God saw them, and God cared. See, that's really the crux of Exodus, is that the people of God are stuck in exile. They're stuck in the dark place. And it feels like no one sees them. It feels like no one will rescue them. And yet Exodus is telling them, no matter what exile or slavery you find yourself in, there is a God who sees you and he takes notice and he will care. You know, that's a pretty good place to begin and end, isn't it? A reminder that no matter where you are today, whatever plight you find yourself in today, whatever exile, perhaps whatever Eden you find yourself in today, that God sees you. It literally means he knows you, and that he also takes notice. In other words, he cares. And we learn right there that God heard their groaning and remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You see, the whole reason for the book of Exodus is to fulfill the covenant to the ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's not just that God hates slavery, but that he has a promise to fulfill all the way back from season 1. And even though it looks like that God forgot about that promise, we got hauled off into captivity here, it doesn't look like God is going to hold up his end of the deal. Season 2 is going to be tying us back to that promise in Genesis and saying, God hasn't let you down. He hasn't given up. And I don't know where you find yourself today, but maybe it's a good encouragement and a good reminder that the same is true for you. That God has not forgotten his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but he also remembers his covenant with you. God sees you. He knows you. He takes notice of you. And he cares. And that is the thrust of the story of Exodus. And whether or not every historical detail is completely accurate, we can start tearing all that apart. But as we do that, we might miss the bigger theological truth that the text is trying to illustrate to us. And that is that God will always care for his people. And he does. This morning, as we conclude, we want to remember God's care for us in our darkest moments, the times we've done the stupidest things and harmed ourselves and others, that even in those moments it was Jesus going to the cross for us. We want to remember God stepping into history and a deliverer showing up who did not just defeat the gods of Babylon and the forces of that empire, but stepped into all the forces of the world and allowed them to do their worst to him, allowed them even to kill him, but then defeated death itself and triumphed over all those forces by coming back to life and then leading his people on a new way, a way out, a new exodus out of life of selfishness and sin and death and greed and hurt, and leading us out to a new way of life, a new promised land where there's a land of love and hope and compassion and forgiveness and goodness, and teaching us what it means to live in this new land. A new life that we will get after we die, of course, but that begins right now and only continues on after death. He's leading us into the promised land now. Jesus is just a new Moses come in a much more significant way. And so this morning, as we go to communion, we want to remember that. Billy's going to take us, play a little song here for us, and perhaps you've got some of those communion elements I mentioned earlier around, and you want to take those and remember Jesus' deliverance from sin and death. We're going to remember that this morning. Let me pray for us and we'll go. God, thank you so much for the ability to wrestle with fun texts like this, to dig in and begin to unlearn some things, relearn some things, discover some things we didn't know were there. Help us as we go through this to be able to step out of sort of our biases and our preconceptions of things and step into the mind of the ancient Israelites and learn what this text really meant for them. And then, of course, to go beyond that, to then extrapolate and apply what could it mean for us today. Thank you that even though this material is very old and it doesn't function maybe in the way that we have often thought, that you still speak through it today, that your word today, that you, Jesus, speaking through your spirit, you are speaking through this text today and still using it to encourage us, even in our darkest places. We're reminded that you've come for us, Jesus, that you have brought us out of a land of death into a way of life. And we remember that this morning as we go to the communion table. We love you, and it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.